All right, so as a reminder, we have the conducting zone and the respiratory zone in the respiratory system. These are all majority of the main structures of the respiratory system. My black line here is separating the conducting zone from the respiratory zone. So everything above that black line, terminal bronchioles all the way to nares, that is all considered conducting zone. That is all going to be structures that are responsible for bringing air into the respiratory system, into the lungs, and filtering, moistening, warming, all of that. Okay. Everything below my black line, not too much, right? So just the respiratory bronchioles, alveolar ducts, and alveolar sacs, um, those are going to be our respiratory zone structures. Okay. So that's where gas exchange actually happens. Now I'm also going to draw a line right here. All right. So my purple line is showing the difference between the upper respiratory tract and the lower respiratory tract. Everything in purple, above the purple, is considered upper respiratory. Okay. So essentially, it's just the nose and the pharynx, but there are some specific parts of those structures that we have to, kind of break down. And then everything after the pharynx, the larynx, trachea, all the bronchi, bronchioles, even the alveolar sacs are considered lower respiratory system. Okay, so there's structural classifications and functional classifications. My black line is showing the functional classifications. My purple line here is showing the structural classifications. Before we dive into anything specific, let's remind ourselves of the muscles of breathing, okay? So this should be a review when we are inhaling at rest or having quiet inspiration. We are using the diaphragm. The diaphragm will contract, and the external intercostal muscles will contract, okay? That's for quiet inhalation. And remember, for quiet exhalation, no muscles contract. It's really just air being expelled by muscles relaxing. Okay, and that's at rest. Now, for forceful inhalation, we learned about the scalene muscle, right, being used for forceful inhalation. But we also can see the sternocleidomastoid and the pectoralis minor participating in forceful inhalation. Forceful exhalation, we learned about the external intercostals and the transverse thoracic. But we also can see the external obliques, the internal obliques, transverse abdominis, and the rectus abdominis also assisting in forceful exhalation. So just kind of a review, adding a few more muscles to that. I'm not going to, test too hard on that because we're out of the muscles. We can breathe. Well, okay. We can relax. We don't, need to put too much stress on those muscles. We don't want to forget them, but not going to put too much emphasis on them, right? Okay. Also, a review is the paranasal sinuses. When we were going over the axial skeleton, when we were going over the skull, we talked about these sinuses. All we talked about were the functions and then knowing, the name of the sinus as well as the bone that the sinus was held in. Okay. So we have the frontal sinus and the frontal bone, the sphenoid sinus and the sphenoid bone, the ethmoid sinus and the ethmoid bone, and the maxillary sinus and the maxilla bone. Okay. And then this image is also showing the nasal cavity as well as the pharynx. Okay. So this is showing that these paranasal sinuses are a part of the upper respiratory tract. These sinuses are going to be lined with a mucous membrane, which means, let's think back, because we're going to say this a lot. in the upper respiratory tract. If something is lined with a mucous membrane, what type of tissue are we going to be using? Or not using, but what tissue is seen there? What is used on top of what's on the apical side on top of these cells to move the mucus? It's cilia. Okay, and cilia is always going to be associated with columnar cells, and we know that that's going to be epithelial cells. So specifically, it is going to be the ciliated pseudostratified columnar epithelial tissue that is going to be seen in the majority of the upper respiratory tract. So anytime I say it has a mucous membrane or it's mucus lined cavity or space, like these sinuses, it's dealing with ciliated pseudostratified. Okay, their functions again should be kind of a review, but they are going to be lightening the skull because they are spaces and cavities. They are going to secrete mucus. They are going to help warm and moisten the air, right? But really only when you're breathing through your nose, because you can see they're associated with the nasal cavity. Okay, if you were to breathe with your mouth, it would just kind of bypass all of those sinuses. So it actually is better and healthier to breathe in with your nose if you can practice that, because you have more structures in place to help filter that air. Okay, and also they can be responsible for or acting as a resonance chamber. Um, and that's why, when we're sick, we have that really nasally, high pitched, kind of stuffy voice because of these sinuses. Okay. Awesome. So let's dive into the upper respiratory tract. So this is a great image. I love this image. It has literally everything labeled, so much more than you really need to know, but also some of it should just kind of be a review. Okay, so if we are an oxygen molecule and we're breathing in through our nose, okay, we are going to start with the external nose. We got to remember that the nose is formed of cartilage. Does anyone remember what type of cartilage? Think about it. Our options are hyaline, fibro, and elastic. It's hyaline cartilage connective tissue. Okay, so there's an entire framework that makes up the external nose. And then, of course, that leads into the bony framework, which would be considered the frontal bone as well as the nasal bone here. But we're not necessarily talking about that. We're just looking at the cartilage here. We can just surmise that cartilaginous framework as hyaline cartilage connective tissue. Okay, so if you're a oxygen molecule and you're entering the nose, entering the external nose, you're going to pass through the external nares or nares. Okay, singular is nares, but we do have two openings. So nares, Nares, would be the plural. Okay, so that is going to bring air into the nose. Fantastic. When you're there, you're now in the nasal cavity. All right. Now, the nasal cavity that is considered the internal nose, right? And it's in a large space, okay, and it's in the anterior portion of the skull. It's above the oral cavity, which we can see here and just kind of understand just by, existing in life. We know that the nasal cavity is above our oral cavity. Fantastic. It does have a vertical partition, which we call the nasal septum. So you may have heard that before. Like, I have a deviated septum or something. Okay. So that's referring to what the portion that divides the nasal cavity into the left and right side. Okay. So the anterior portion of your nasal septum is going to be the hyaline cartilage, but the posterior portion is going to be composed of like the vomer and the ethmoid, the maxilla, and as well as the palatine bones. Okay. Awesome. So we do have two openings in the nasal cavity in the internal nose called the internal nares, right? Or nares if it's singular. On this image, it is showing just one. Okay, and so it's referring to this right here as an opening on the posterior side. So that would be the nares because it's one, because we're just showing a sagittal section, right? So we can't see the other side, right? So we can't even see the septum because essentially we cut along the septum, all right? So all of this nasal cavity is going to be lined with a mucous membrane, right? So that means it is the ciliated pseudostratified columnar, all right? And we do have some familiar structures as we're moving through the nasal cavity, okay? Now, first we have the nasal vestibule, right? So we're going from the external nares into the nasal vestibule, and then we're going to reach the nasal concha, concha. Anyways, the superior and middle portions of the nasal concha is part of the ethmoid bone, and then the inferior nasal concha is the is its own bone, okay, and it is paired. All right, so if we remember that from the axioskeleton when we went over the skull. All right, now kind of underneath those structures, it kind of creates these little pockets, these little folds called nasal meatus or meatuses. Okay, so you have the superior, middle, and inferior kind of going along with those structures as well. And really, the whole purpose of these combined is to increase the surface area again, to help filter and moisten. And with these meatuses and the nasal concha, it's also going to prevent dehydration by trapping water as we exhale through our nose. Okay, so definitely breathing through our nose is kind of a more healthier thing to do. It just keeps everything moistened and filtered properly. All right. Some other things to note is we also have the olfactory epithelium here. So that is going to be where we have our olfaction, right? So we did say that that was a portion of or function of the respiratory system, so olfactory region essentially, and that is kind of right below the ethmoid bone, and where those olfactory foramina would be allowing the olfactory nerves to come down. So we do have this olfactory region here superior of the nasal cavity. Okay, we can also see some of our sinuses. We have the frontal sinus and the sphenoid sinus. We've got the sphenoid bone, the sella turcica. The pituitary gland would be sitting right there. Fantastic. Okay, so that's pretty much everything in the nose that we would need to know. Okay, and remember, never going to ask you to identify those sinuses. Just kind of understanding what they are, what bones they are found in, and their functions. Okay? Awesome. So let's move on to the next structure, which would be the pharynx. Okay? So the pharynx is posterior to the nasal and oral cavities. And it's going to be composed of skeletal muscles in its walls as well as a mucous membrane lining it. So we can see skeletal muscle kind of lining this region right here. There are like circular and linear goodness compositions of that skeletal muscle, but we don't really need to pay attention to that too much. But the reason that there is skeletal muscle there is because we have that deglutition the swallowing, right? So deglutition is, it's a kind of a voluntary, but also could be involuntary action that's going to be done by a skeletal muscle, kind of around the pharynx, all right? Now, so pharynx also houses the tonsils. We have 3 tonsils, and those tonsils are going to help with the immune system. They they help kind of initiate reactions, immune responses against any type of foreign invader. Okay. So, when you're looking at the pharynx, there are 3 regions. We have the nasopharynx, the oropharynx, and the laryngopharynx. And so they are color coded here for us as well. Okay, so the nasopharynx. The nasopharynx is going to have one tonsil. One of the tonsils is the pharyngeal tonsils, also sometimes called the adenoid tonsil, but we typically teach it as the pharyngeal. So it is located right here. It is posterior from the nasal cavity, and it goes all the way down to the soft plate right here, we can see. All right. Now, the nasopharynx is going to, of course, be facilitating air moistening. It does have, a mucous membrane, but it's also going to, because it has openings to your ear, your inner ear. Okay, so you can see opening of the auditory tube, or sometimes called eustachian tube. It is also going to help equalize air pressure between your middle ear and the atmosphere. Okay, so nasopharynx, part of the conducting zone, but also helping out with equalizing pressure. Okay, then we have the oropharynx, which is going to be just strictly posterior from the oral cavity. And it goes basically from the soft palate all the way down to the hyoid bone. Excuse me. Is the hyoid bone on? Yes, it is right here. Yeah, so it goes from the soft palate all the way to the hyoid bone. Excuse me. The thing about the oropharynx is because it is right behind the oral cavity, it's not just going to have respiratory function, it's also going to have digestive function. And because it's helping out with the digestive system and food is actually going to be passing through it, there's risk for the tissue to be torn because of food particles and abrasion. So the oropharynx is actually going to be lined by an epithelial tissue that can sustain that type of abrasion, which will be the non-keratinized stratified squamous epithelial tissue. All right. So multiple functions in the oropharynx. The oropharynx also houses the other 2 types of tonsils. So you have the palatine tonsils right here, and then you also have the lingual tonsils right here below. Kind of inferior to the tongue. Okay. So if you ever get like tonsil stones or anything, or you're looking at your tonsils, typically you're going to be viewing your palatine tonsils. And if you were trying to extract a tonsil stone from those tonsils, it'd be from those palatine tonsils. Yeah. Okay. Fantastic. So now we can move on to the last region of the pharynx and really the last portion of the upper respiratory tract, which is the laryngopharynx. Or sometimes it's called the hypopharynx, which kind of, I don't know, makes a little bit more sense to me. But laryngopharynx, it is sitting right above the larynx. All right. Now, it is also going to have double functionality. So it is also going to be, functioning with the respiratory system, but also the digestive system, which means that the laryngopharynx is also going to be lined with non-keratinized stratified squamous epithelial tissue. The portions of the laryngopharynx, right? So we can see that It basically goes from the hyoid bone all the way to the um, esophagus and also the voice box. Okay, your vocal cords, which we'll talk about. Okay, so here's the start of the esophagus. Essentially, here's the hyoid bone. So all of this would be the laryngopharynx. Here we have it all on the cadaver. Okay, so we can still see some of those sinuses. Our olfactory bulb, the olfactory nerves would be coming down in here into the olfactory region. We have our nasal cavity here. We can see here would be the external nares. We have our different portions of the oral cavity, the tongue, and then basically finding the oral cavity helps us find, okay, right behind that's going to be the oropharynx, which means right below it's going to be the laryngopharynx, and right above it is going to be the nasopharynx, which, yes, it is labeled. Okay. And we could also see the auditory tube or eustachian tube contributing to the functions of the nasopharynx. And we can find our different bones as well as to help us with, kind of marking the start and stop of the nasopharynx, oropharynx, and laryngopharynx. Here we have, again, just some key points of the portions of the pharynx, right? Which tonsils are going to be found in, each region, and also a nice color-coded map for us for the pharynx.